why don't we begin? First, let me thank everybody for taking time out of their day to join me for the 2021 State of the College. And certainly as I reflected on the past year and thought about the way to approach this and a bit of a theme to focus on, my mind wandered a little bit to think about the quotes. You know, often these kinds of presentations include a quote to sort of get the conversation started. And I thought of a number of them. I went from, from Dickens, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times, but there really aren't many bests, and I sort of threw that one out. I thought about grand statements from people like Churchill, who said, if you're going through hell, keep going. But then I really thought I should try to get a little more focused and not necessarily go across the ocean to get a quote. And so, of course, you now get down to sort of the Yogi Berra quotes, who said, the future ain't what it used to be, which is also true. But finally, I actually decided on something a little bit more perhaps descriptive, and that was the Grateful Dead from 1970, lyrics from the song Truckin'. Lately, it's occurred to me what a long, strange trip it's been. And indeed, this year has been long, and this year has been strange. If we think to only a year ago, everything was operating smoothly. Everybody was coming to campus. Our entire educational patient care and research program was based upon personal engagement, on-campus activities and student affairs, clubs, events. Even our accreditation was defined by in-person standards. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And in a very short period of time, everything that we did was thrown into a state of upheaval. We could no longer be in the classroom. We could no longer even be in the clinic for many of our students, and many of the kinds of patient care that we provide was suspended. Student affairs, student clubs could not meet. In-person counseling was not necessarily available. And so we had to act, and we had to act quickly. Our infrastructure, our financial position, our ability to get protective gear, policies, protocols, technologies, staffing, training, communications, everything was predicated on personal engagement and in-person communication. And it had to be rethought and rethought quickly. Now, I'm not going to go through these slides in detail, and certainly this will be posted on the web and you may want to take a look at it. But if we really think back to a year ago, the pandemic really started March 1st, when there was the first diagnosed case in New York City. The first death was on March 14th. And 6 weeks later, by May 1st, there were over 18,000, nearly 19,000 deaths. Many of the faculty will remember that on March 8th, we held a faculty retreat, an overnight faculty retreat. I guess we can think of it as the last hurrah, because it was actually the last sizable event that we held, and certainly it was a good time. You might say we kind of got in under the wire. It may, in fact, that we got in over the wire, because clearly it appears the pandemic was already here and already expanding over time. But in a very short period of time, our faculty, our staff, our administration adjusted very quickly. By the middle of March, we were suspending lectures. We suspended the clinic for the first 3 years on March 16th. By March 19th, the fourth-year externships were suspended. In 10 days, we had virtual clinics going live. We had remote lectures. And Dr. Troilo and the Academic Affairs Group basically addressed our accreditation issues, and New York State Department of Ed by March 28th had approved the program modifications that we put into effect. Telehealth went up. Final exams became remote and secure, and we graduated on time. And of course, then on May 25th, with the murder of George Floyd, we also had social justice issues confronting our society, and they confronted our campus as well. Since that time, you know, it always seems as though we get confronted with new challenges. Many of those new challenges were not necessarily the surprises of the pandemic, but it was the challenges of new Department of Health regulations, new CDC regulations, new system administrative regulations. You know, we've been engaged in ongoing development of plans and ramp up plans about how we're going to provide the education, patient care, and research that we're committed to as an institution. Notably, a large part of that was assuring the safety of our community and making sure that what we did minimized the risk. And certainly a large part of our activity, both for our students as well as for our research endeavors and clearly for our patient care endeavors, really require that we be in person. And so we had to learn how to do that while minimizing the risk of infection. So what you see here is really a whole series of plans, mandates, updates. The most recent one that you're familiar with is weekly testing of all students and faculty. And certainly, you know, if you sort of look at the graphic, cases in our second wave, which really started coming up in October and then really accelerated through the holidays, you know, the cases certainly exceeded in New York State, exceeded what happened back in April, although for New York City, last April was much more intense. And in fact, you know, we've obviously learned from the past 8 months, the past 10 months, 11 months, and that even though the number of cases are much higher than they used to be, the number of deaths and hospitalizations as well is much lower. And so the management of the disease has become much more effective than what it was. That doesn't necessarily modify the challenge or the safety measures, but it is some small solace. Now, what's really quite amazing to me, and these are some wonderful statistics, in terms of thinking about what our community did to make sure that we continued with the programs that we had. Since the onset of the pandemic, more than 1,400 hours of remote lectures. Now over 2,200 in-person clinic hours and 572 lab hours that were completed safely by students. Amazingly, and if there's anybody out there who thinks we don't assess our students enough, this number may make you think twice. 12,559 individual exams and quizzes administered via ExamSoft. And one that I really love, because I think it was actually critical to the successful completion of last spring's clinical training, was that there were 33,377 individual virtual patient experiences last spring and over the summer. So those are some remarkable numbers, and I think they are a testimony to the creativity and the resilience of the community. In terms of safety, and these numbers are, I think, actually up through this morning. Since August 1st, which is when system administration started dashboards and having us begin to monitor these things more carefully, across the entire campus, faculty, students, staff, administration, all employees, we know about 40 cases of COVID. Most of those have occurred during vacation periods, long weekends, and because they were symptomatic, they were actually diagnosed off campus. On campus, we've now done over 2,500 tests, the majority of those obviously the pool testing, but we've only had 6 positive tests from our on-campus testing, 5 of those in the pool, 1 in the rapid. So our positivity rate using the dashboard developed by System is 0.24%. We also know that none of the cases were transmitted on campus or resulted in transmission on campus. And that came out of the contact tracing that was done by the team. If we look more recently, since people came back, and again, I use these dates because it's what the system administration dashboard was using, but from the 11th of January through yesterday, We've been doing a lot of testing and clearly a lot more the last 2 weeks, but we only had one student test positive, which resulted in a 0.13% positivity rate. And we have not had a single employee test positive for 0%. SUNY across the campuses is at 0.47 for students and 0.32 for employees. And across New York State, that positivity rate is 4.9%. Now, the positivity rates, because it's limited to what we have on campus, has some limitation in terms of how it applies. But clearly, we are doing better by far, I think, than most. I think more critically is that our community, our campus, has not been a venue for transmission of the disease. To help us in terms of thinking about safety and a return to normalcy, vaccinations, and we were fortunate to be eligible as a community and as a campus because we're a healthcare profession, really began in early January. Certainly thanks to Downstate Medical Center for their willingness to serve as a resource for us besides other community sites. But when we look at where we are, we have an on-campus population of somewhere between 600 and 625. Right now, we have 341 members of our community have reported, that they've received their first dose or second dose. And we have 16 that know they have a first dose appointment. So, we've got close to 360 in the pipeline, and our vaccination level is now 55 or 60%. Personally, I want to just sort of step aside, and I want to certainly encourage anybody who has not sought out the vaccine to do so. Part of the safety of the institution is by, I guess you could call it a local herd immunity. It probably doesn't really quite hold. But the medical centers are somewhere between 60 and 80%, most of them in terms of their community. But as we go to 70%, 75, 80%, it really creates an additional level of protection that allows us to think about a more engaged future. I do want to do a special call out to the COVID emergency response team. Our first meeting was March 2nd. Almost a year ago. If we could get together, we would have to have an anniversary party. But this group of individuals has been meeting in the beginning multiple times per week, weekly, and now usually about every other week, but to oversee and manage the community's response to the pandemic. And each and every one has been willing to step up and do whatever is necessary to make sure that we meet our obligations as a community. Now, in an earlier slide, I did refer to the murder of George Floyd and the fact that we as a community also had to have some very honest and frank discussions about social justice, race, and equity. And as that debate sort of raged across the nation, we also had an obligation to confront issues on our own campus, and certainly our own students of color. I think were very, very influential in bringing it to our, not to our attention, but certainly heightening our awareness that what perhaps we thought was a diverse, inclusive, and dynamic community was perhaps not as inclusive and dynamic, or perhaps as diverse as it could be. And so a couple of things happened in response. One actually was the webinar series Conversations on Race. Drs. Bavenzi and Shirazian approached and spoke with Dr. Madonna and Betsy Torres about the idea of doing an open discussion on a more national level on these issues. And impressively, it really took hold. And as you can see, the 3 webinars that took place have had over 8,350 views. It certainly put us not necessarily at the forefront of solutions, but it put us at the forefront of the conversation and recognizing how important that conversation was. The second, of course, was my appointment of the Task Force on Race and Equity. And the goal is to establish an ongoing, sustainable effort to ensure that ours is a diverse, inclusive, and dynamic community that is safe, honest, and open, and through which differences are celebrated. Now, that task force did tremendous work over a very short period of time. I had established a goal of completing a final report within 4 months. That report was delivered. They broke out into teams. They addressed different elements across the community, in terms of ways in which we can improve as a organization, as a community, on issues of diversity and inclusion. Now, in terms of the early impact, the report was submitted on November 1st as requested, but their first priority was asking us to look at hiring a director of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And as you all know, we found quite quickly Dr. Joy Harewood, who is going to be starting her job on March 1st. And I'm thrilled that she's going to be joining the community in that role. And I really look forward to her efforts, along with our Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Albie Airy, and actually the TFRE and the entire community to move forward on these issues. Newsletters were launched, Black Week occurred. We had the community book project with Dr. Damon Tweedy, the author, of the book. Talent show, Taste of NOSA. It was a wonderful week. And I applaud, the very quick efforts of the TFRE to begin to address their own recommendations. We do have community training and diversity training coming up. We had actually held back a little bit because of some restrictions on what could be included in diversity training by the Department of Education in Washington under the prior administration. Those have been rescinded, and so the conversation can be much more, I think, open, frank, and honest, and I'm looking forward to implementing that training. So what we've really seen is, I think, tremendous power of our own community on so many levels, whether it's programmatic, technological, whether it's maintaining a significant relationship in the absence of in-person activities. You name it, we did it, and we've become much more sophisticated in doing it. Perhaps, one example of that is our own Eyes on New York event, which we had to cancel last March. And we basically did it in early December, all virtually, but done extremely well by Dawn Rigney and her team. And I think it performed tremendously, but it was also a great example of the kinds of things we can do. We have to invest a little bit of resources, but we can certainly make many of our events going forward much more effective, using a virtual platform. Something that I would like to share with the community, and some of you have seen this data, but Dr. Albie Airy and his team, in January, I think they started a year ago, maybe perhaps it was 2, but they started doing a little bit of a class climate survey of the first year class to see really what their perceptions were and how they were feeling after the first semester. And this is the data from the class of 2024. And, and I didn't put the data up here compared, there was comparison to the class of 2023. And interestingly, the class of 2024 pretty much scored higher in almost, I think, every measure. And, please, kind of look at this data. Again, it's publicly available. It will be available as part of this presentation. But when you look at the items of treating with respect, feeling they have access, getting support they need, the ratings were extraordinarily high, and certainly 70%, more than 70% of that class participated. When you look at the elements that fell below the 90%, it was really an issue of connection to the class, meaningful friendships, faculty members or staff members that they can go to for a personal problem, not for an academic problem. They feel like that's well covered, and feeling a part of the college. And so those are challenges. Those, I think, are part of the collateral damage of being a remote and virtual community for many of our activities. We also saw many of our own members actually progress. These are some career advancements, some promotions, faculty promotions, staff promotions that occurred throughout the year. Congratulations to these folks. But I think it's a nice demonstration that we didn't put everything aside, and certainly we encourage support and want to see our staff and faculty grow and advance regardless of what's going on in the environment. So 1 year into the pandemic, we've overcome a major challenge. We're not out of it, but certainly the challenge to our ability to teach, research, and care for patients. How are we doing? I'm going to go through some of this fairly quickly, and some of this is things that you see more routinely, but it's important to know that we haven't really lost a step. If you look at the class of 2024 that just came in this past fall, their numbers, their statistics, average GPAs compared to national OAT scores, were all very comparable to prior classes, and we are still attracting an excellent student body. It is getting more challenging, attracting non-New Yorkers to New York in the midst of a pandemic, and I think it will impact the class of 2025, can be a challenging endeavor. And I know that Christian Alberto and the admissions community staff and the admissions committee are working hard. We've got certainly we're still doing extremely well, but it is a little bit more of a headwind than in the past. We do see in the national trends last year there was a little bit of an uptick in terms of the applicant pool. We didn't see quite that uptick here, maybe very tiny. But what's more concerning, at least to me, is that medicine, nursing, dentistry, many of those have seen major upticks in their applications. Our admissions yield is strong. We're still well above the national average. But you do see sort of over the past 4 years, very small, almost kind of 1% per year erosion, which may not be significant in and of itself, but I think is testimony to the competitive environment that we find ourselves in, and certainly protecting the high quality of student and attracting that student to our college is very important. And it's very important not just for the quality of student we want to attract and the kind of optometrists we want to produce, but over time, tuition has now also become our primary source of revenue. And so protecting that asset is critical. Certainly very much linked to our endeavor to have a very diverse community. Certainly our faculty needs to increase diversity, as does our student body. We did do extraordinarily well with the class of 2024, with 17 students of color, coming in with that class. And certainly this year, making steady progress. I mean, that was a tremendous year. I don't know whether we will repeat it this year, but we're certainly doing, I think, very well in terms of trying to make sure that the next incoming class is diverse as well. You can see that we have had we're still mid-cycle. I think we've got 7 students of color who have committed, another 3 who've been offered admission, decisions are pending, and there will be still more to come. Degrees, we're sort of flat, in terms of, we're not growing our OD program, so we don't anticipate seeing that increase. But I think a very nice statistic with this class was that 45% were planning to enter residencies. I would probably venture that our student body may go into residencies perhaps at among, if not the highest, certainly nearly the highest rate of any college or any program in the country. Board performances, we were very concerned a year ago because the graduating class of 2019 struggled a bit with the board. So for the first time in recent memory, we did see a time in which the pass rate in which our graduates had passed all 3 parts by graduation actually fell below the national average. We didn't know whether it was a one-time effect or whether it was some kind of indication or trends. Certainly some corrective measures were taken. But as you can see, the class of 2020 basically went right back to where we were before, and so, we have to continue to support our students and try to assure their success on national boards. But 97% of the class of 2020 passed all three parts. National benchmarks, looking at ASCO data, the research, now this is awards, this is not actual expenses, but when you look at the awards for the past fiscal year and the data that was produced for ASCO, we're second in the country in terms of total awards. The NII funding is down a bit. Hopefully that will come back up. And we are first in the country in terms of the work with industry. In FY 2020, Dr. Bloomfield shared that we had 22 new grant awards. Again, these are awards totaling $3,173,720 to be precise. We also have the largest class of new ODMS students, and we got our first resident PhD candidate this year as well. CVRC is thriving, and Dr. Jinyun Wang joined our research faculty. Now, in terms of the impact on the patient care program, obviously things went south last March. You can see the effect in 2019, 2020 in terms of total, with the total patient census at about 50,000 when we're usually up at 70,000. This year, obviously in the first half, over the summer, we were ramping up slowly. So we saw that deficit from the prior year, and hopefully we'll make up much of the ground over time. But actually a great demonstration of that impact, and I think it's important for everybody to understand it, was when you look at this is the patient census. And so, if you look at February of last year, fiscal year 2020, March, the bottom fell out mid-March when we started suspending activities. And down in April, we were down to, 200 patients total for the month, when we're usually up at around 6,000. Some small growth because of telemedicine in May. And then, in June, we began to ramp up again. And you can see the recovery during this fiscal year to the point where we are now usually between 90 and 95% of the pre-pandemic levels. But this also has a big impact on our revenues. And I do want to get a little bit into our finances to share with you in a very transparent way where we are. If you look at the total loss using March 1st as the start of the pandemic, in terms of patient care revenues through the end of January, we lost $2,500,000 plus dollars in revenues. And for the fiscal year, clearly, by March 1st fiscal year, we will be down about $1 million thus far total. So this is money that we will never recover. It's not that there was a pent-up demand and suddenly we had more patients than we had before the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, as you're all acutely aware, we did take some actions, and some of those were mandated by the state and by system. Some were just wise in terms of how to manage, what was a bit of a disaster. We had a hiring freeze, and you can look at the FTE. April 1st is when the hiring freeze went into effect. That was a state mandated hiring freeze. Since that time, we have had people leave, and there were vacancies on April 1st as well. But as of January 1st, we were down a little over 10 positions, not including the satellite, but either way, satellite clinics, but about 10 positions, and when you combine it, with those that were already open, everybody's departments are straining, and we know that. We did approve a couple of positions here and there through the first 6 months, and I approved another 6+ or so in January as we begin to get a better sense of what's happening in the future. when we're looking at criticality, but we are, I think, on our way back. It's going to be a while before we get back up to what was full pre-pandemic, but we do have a good opportunity. But we reduced and froze non-personnel costs. We froze travel, and that's still in effect. We deferred buying significant equipment and other capital purchases. And to give you an idea of what these steps impacted is if we look back over a year and a half to the beginning of the 1920 fiscal year budget, right now we're on track to spend this year almost $6 million less than we were going to spend the year before. Our total savings from what we budgeted this year, and we budgeted very tightly this year, we've actually saved, we haven't saved, we're projected to save almost $2.3 million over the original budget. And of course, everybody is feeling that pain just in terms of meeting all of our obligations. But it's important. It's an important sacrifice. This is a bit simplified, but I've done this in other years. This is our operating budget. The green line is the revenues. The red line are our expenses. And what you really see here is last March, or last fiscal year, our revenues totally bottomed out. Now, some of that it's a $10 million loss, or about a $10 million difference from the year before. Part of that is patient care revenues, but certainly not all of it. Some of it is actually just a cash flow issue because we actually did not get most of our money from the state of New York during the last fiscal year. If you kind of look at it, what happened was we got a big payment of over $6 million last July. So that gets allocated to this fiscal year rather than last. And in this graph, you can see there's an orange chunk, in this year's revenue stack. If we were to move that over to last year, which is where it should have gone, this curve suddenly begins to look like this, which will land us at the end of this year with a deficit. And it will continue to project the deficit depending upon our actions. And so as we move forward, we do need to think about how do we return to a healthier revenue cycle. And we do have to continue to think about being constrained on our expenses, but certainly not at the level that we've been doing this year. For those of you who've been around, if you go back further, you will recall we've been here before. The Great Recession of 2009, 2010, which for state agencies really drifted into fiscal year 2011. Again, the bottom fell out. Our budgets were cut by system, and we had to recover. Now, and we recovered, and we covered well. And quite honestly, I believe we can do this again. But we've tried to engineer a soft landing. We've tried to project jobs. I'm confident that we've protected jobs, and I'm very comfortable that we'll continue to do so, and we will begin to fill the positions that are vacant, certainly in the next fiscal year. This is our fund balances, and this is sort of our security blanket, our opportunity funds. We've had a very healthy one, and as you can see, at the end of fiscal year 19, we had over $19 million in our fund balances. Some people think of these as reserves. And during the fiscal year 20, when the state did not pay us within that fiscal year, you can see we basically used $10 million of that fund to basically pay for all of our operations. Of course, when we did get that funding, this fiscal year sort of bounced us back up to where we're projected to finish the year right now, between $14 and $15 million, but with a deficit. And so if we don't address that going forward, we will see that erosion. The red line, so is basically a state rule or a SUNY rule that campuses should have at least a minimum of 25% of their operating budget, that's 3 months of operating costs, in reserve. It's sort of your security blanket. It's what you don't want to be below. We use often a 33% and kind of look at that buffer where we have to be very cautionary. And above that was sort of our opportunity zone. So the dollars we had for opportunity um, have been expended to a significant degree, but we do have the opportunity to continue to rebuild. The other thing to point out, and again, this was all mostly good news, certainly in 2019, 2020, almost $10 million was invested in our facilities, whether it was the library, there's an image on the right, of sort of a new layout for the 7th floor if we get the funding to do, our rehabilitation of the adult primary care unit. And then, of course, the pediatric facilities. But there was also the lower lobby, there was the mechanical. And so last year, actually, we had more money invested in our facilities in the history of this campus. This year, it's much lower. We completed the facilities projects, but again, the state pretty much put a clamp down on anything but the most critical of maintenance. So, in some ways that's, probably more than in the past. I'm focusing on the year in review, and I think it's important because I think it's important that truly people understand, well, it has been a strange year. It's been a challenging year, but it's a year in which the community did come together. It is a year that while, we certainly struggle with the challenges, we have every reason to feel pride and comfort with where we are at this point in time. But it's also a year, in which we probably did not make as much progress on our strategic plan as we had hoped, or as we might expect. You will be getting, they came in yesterday. It's up on our web, but this year's annual report, Focus on 2020, is now available, and you all have access to copies of that. But I often think, this year, in a strange way, there are certainly elements of each of these that, in fact, we probably have positively impacted. But much of our long-range planning also got consumed by our efforts to respond to changes in our external environment. In thinking about the past state of the colleges, 4 years ago, strategic planning, the current strategic plan in 2019 focused on big transformations in the profession and optometric education externally. In the last year, I had the opportunity to really speak about framework for the future, really taking that extremely long-term view for the college. We did the assessment, knowing that we needed to think about adding programs, expanding our activities, increasing our revenue streams, while positively impacting and advancing our mission. And then when I thought of the state of the college 2021, the theme was sort of COVID-19 or life on pause. In spite of that pause, we are financially sound. And certainly compared to many, in fact, most of the campuses across the system, we're actually in a very good position. I do believe we're stronger as a community. We are resilient as a community, and we've taught or learned that we can be extremely innovative as a community and be very effective. And these are characteristics that I think are critical, as we begin to refocus on the future. And so in many ways, back to the future, I'm hoping that this summer we can begin to be looking forward much more aggressively, that we can go back to that conversation on framework for the future. The last faculty retreat, last March 8th, we actually spent considerable time talking about this issue. And I still have on my desk a tremendous amount of feedback from breakout groups that we've never had the opportunity to then process. And these are the kinds of things that we need to get back to as a community. So in closing, actually, I really wanted to let the community know that one, I can't think of a better community, a group of individuals, faculty, staff, students that I would have rather have faced the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic than this one. And I think that everybody, and I hope that everybody has sort of learned to appreciate the community as a whole over the past 11 months. I'm also desperately hopeful that, in fact, the light is at the end of the tunnel. Our community is becoming immunized, and I hope many more of you do in the coming months. But we do have the opportunity to begin to refocus on the future. What you do see here actually is our 50th anniversary logo. Thank you to Don Rigney and the 50th anniversary advisory group for looking at this and putting it together. April 14th was the day that Nelson Rockefeller signed the legislation creating the institution, and July 1st was the first day that the institution came into being at the start of its fiscal year with a budget to begin its programming as the State University of New York College of Optometry. So I want to thank everybody